Who was Alexander Hamilton? On July 11th, 1804, high above the Hudson River in Weehawken, New Jersey, two men met at dawn. They were Alexander Hamilton, a Revolutionary War hero, and the first Secretary of the Treasury, and Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States. They had come to fight a duel. Why? In the early 1800s, dueling was common. When two gentlemen got into a fight that they couldn't settle with words, they agreed to meet with pistols instead. In a secluded place, they faced each other. They planned to point and shoot at the same time. If they were lucky enough, both men would survive. The men stood high on a rock cliff facing the water. They were hidden by trees. This was a popular spot for duels. A man who refused to fight a duel was seen as a coward. But dueling was illegal in New York City, where Alexander and Aaron lived. New Yorkers could be punished for dueling. That is why they had come to Weehawken, a spot right across the river from New York City. New Jersey was not as strict about dueling. Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr had known each other for many years. Sometimes they worked together as lawyers or in the government. Often they disagreed. A few weeks earlier, Alexander had insulted Aaron at a dinner party. Aaron demanded an apology when he found out, but Alexander refused. Friends of the two men tried to make peace between them, but it was no use. Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr raised their pistols and took their aim. Only one would survive. Chapter 1, A Caribbean Childhood. On January 11th, 1755, Alexander Hamilton was born on Nevis, a small island in the West Indies. It is now part of the country called the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. It was a British colony, which meant it was governed by Great Britain and its king, George III. Alexander's parents were James Hamilton and Rachel Fawcett. James had grown up in Scotland, where his family lived in a castle, but as the youngest son, James did not inherit it. He came to the West Indies hoping to make money, but he wasn't very good at it. Rachel Fawcett had been born in the West Indies, and her family was French. James and Rachel were not married. Rachel had married another man when she was young, but he was very mean. She ran away, leaving behind a son, and she never saw him again. Rachel and James lived together as husband and wife and had two children, James and Alexander. Many white people on the island made money by growing sugarcane. Most of the sugarcane was picked by slaves who had been brought to the islands from Africa. It was a terrible job, standing in the hot sun and harvesting the plants. So terrible that many slaves died within 5 years of being sent to the island. Perhaps it was seeing people suffer this way that turned Alexander against slavery for the rest of his life. Alexander loved to read both in English and French, a language he learned from his mother. He probably wasn't allowed to go to a formal school because his parents weren't married, so he was tutored. But in his small town, Alexander and James didn't really think of themselves as different from other children. It wasn't unusual for boys to be taught at home. In 1765, James Hamilton moved the family to another island called St. Croix, which today is part of the United States Virgin Islands. In St. Croix, Alexander and his brother James started to understand for the first time that they were different from other children because their parents were not married. Some people on the island did not approve. In 1766, when Alexander was 11 years old, his father abandoned his family. He didn't think he could support them anymore and went off to one of the other islands to try to earn more money. A year later, Alexander and his mother got very sick. No one knew what the illness was, but for days they both lay in bed burning with fever. Alexander recovered, but his mother died. James and Alexander went to live with an adult cousin, but he too died within just a few years. Now the boys were truly alone in the world. Everything their mother had owned belonged to her first husband. So the boys were left with nothing, with their mother dead and their father gone, they had no idea what their future would hold. Alexander's brother James was apprenticed to a carpenter on St. Croix. That meant he would live with the carpenter and eventually learn to be one himself. He and Alexander never saw each other again. Alexander was taken in by Thomas Stevens, a merchant who lived on the island. Thomas had 5 children of his own, and one, Edward, was a year older than Alexander. Alexander and Edward, called Ned, became the best of friends. Although he was only 13, Alexander was given a job as a clerk in a mercantile house, a business that traded and shipped goods all over the world. Alexander was determined to learn everything he could about the business. He was very good at math and had no trouble keeping track of all the money and products that came in and went out. He was so good at his job that when one of the owners went to New York for 5 months, he left Alexander in charge of the entire business. Alexander was only 14 years old. Although he was doing well at his job, Alexander didn't want to work there forever. He dreamed of leaving the West Indies and becoming famous, maybe joining an army and becoming a war hero. He longed to follow Ned Stevens to New York, where his friend was going to school to become a doctor. But Alexander didn't have the money to travel. In 1770, St. Croix's first newspaper, the Royal Danish American Gazette, was published. Alexander was excited to write for it. In 1771, when he was 16, he published 2 love poems in the paper. More poems followed. Another part-time writer at the paper was a minister named Hugh Knox. He and Alexander became friends. On August 31st, 1772, a terrible hurricane hit the island of St. Croix. Roaring winds knocked down trees, and a tidal wave over 15 feet high pounded the shores. The Gazette described it as the most dreadful hurricane known in the memory of man. The hurricane was so big, it caused destruction on the neighboring islands of St. Kitts and Nevis as well. A few days later, at a Sunday service, Hugh Knox preached a sermon about the hurricane. Alexander was inspired to write his own version of the story in a letter to his father. James Hamilton was probably living on an island just outside the range of the hurricane. Alexander wrote a dramatic letter, describing all the horrors of the storm. Before sending the letter, he showed it to his friend Hugh. The minister was impressed. Hugh thought it was so good that Alexander should publish it in the paper. The Gazette printed Alexander's letter on October 3rd, 1772, with an introduction by Hugh Knox explaining that its author was still just a teenager. In part, the letter read, "The roaring of the sea and wind, fiery meteors flying about in the air, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of the fallen houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into angels." Alexander's letter was an unprecedented hit with the people of St. Croix. Everyone was impressed by how well it was written. They thought he had really captured the force and destruction of the hurricane. Many wealthy people decided to take up a collection to send Alexander to America so that he could go to college. A boy who could write such a letter, they thought, should not stay on their little island. He should have a chance to make his mark on the world. Alexander Hamilton was going to New York. Alexander arrived in New York City in 1773. Ned Stevens was waiting for him there. Alexander also quickly made friends with a young tailor named Hercules Mulligan. Hugh Knox had written to friends he knew in New York, so Alexander met even more people through him. He enrolled in the Elizabethtown Academy in New Jersey, where he studied Latin, Greek, and advanced math. After 6 months, he was ready to apply for college. Now known as Princeton University, the College of New Jersey had been Alexander's first choice. Although he was only 18, he felt his education was way behind other young men his age. Alexander had heard of another young man, Aaron Burr, who graduated from the College of New Jersey at 16. So he asked the president of the college if he could complete his studies in only 2 years. He wanted to graduate as quickly as he could. The president refused. So Alexander enrolled in another school, King's College in New York City, which is now called Columbia University. At King's College, everyone was talking about revolution. New York at that time was one of the 13 colonies owned by Great Britain. Like Alexander's home in Nevis, it was under the control of the British King George III. Many colonists were angry that the king taxed the colonies for their money, but did not give them a voice in the government. The president of King's College, Dr. Miles Cooper, was a Tory. The Tory party thought that the American colonies should be loyal to Britain. But Alexander believed in American independence from Britain. Just outside the college grounds on Lower Broadway in Manhattan was an area called the Fields. Anyone was welcome to make public speeches there. Alexander had listened to many speakers at the Fields. One day he decided to speak himself. He started out shyly. He'd never spoken in public before, but soon he was making a powerful argument against the rule of Great Britain in the colonies. When he finished, the crowd was shocked at first. Alexander was only 19 and looked even younger, yet he spoke like a much older man. "It is a collegian," people whispered to one another. From that day on, New Yorkers recognized Alexander as a voice in favor of revolution. He also started writing articles arguing for independence in local newspapers. One of the things Alexander spoke about that day in the Fields was the Boston Tea Party. Students at King's College knew that any day war might break out between the colonies and Great Britain. So they formed student groups and practiced military drills like soldiers. Alexander and his friends formed their own group called the Hearts of Oak. Alexander started studying military strategy in case he ever found himself on a real battlefield. One night, a mob formed in the streets of New York. They wanted to attack Dr. Miles Cooper because he supported the British. Although Alexander was in favor of independence, he was horrified at the idea of attacking someone just because they had different political views. Alexander vowed to protect him. He stood up to the crowd, telling them that violence could only hurt their cause. He couldn't stop the crowd, but he delayed them long enough for Dr. Miles Cooper to escape in his nightgown. In April 1775, the first real battle between British troops and the colonists took place in Massachusetts. In June of that year, George Washington was named commander of the American troops, the Continental Army. He marched through New York City on his way to Massachusetts. Alexander was in the crowd cheering him on. In August of that year, a British warship arrived in New York Harbor. Everyone feared that the British would try to steal the 24 cannons kept in New York. Alexander and 15 members of the Hearts of Oak volunteered to attempt to hide the cannons. They saved 10 big guns before the warship fired on them, frightening thousands of New Yorkers and sending them screaming into the streets. After that success, it was not surprising when 6 short months later, Alexander Hamilton was named a captain of artillery in New York's first official regiment. Alexander's dream of one day being a war hero were on their way to becoming true. All of Alexander's studying about battle, strategy, and military exercises paid off when he became a captain in the army. People had already heard of his bravery in New York, and many military leaders wanted to work with him. The most important of these was none other than George Washington himself. Washington and Alexander fought together at the Battle of White Plains in October 1776. 2 months later, on December 25th, Alexander joined Washington in a surprise attack in Trenton, New Jersey. There was a force of Hessians, German soldiers, fighting for the British. Washington and his men were in Pennsylvania. Late at night, they crossed the Delaware River that separated them from the British forces. The river was dangerous that time of year, icy and rough. It was a risk, but it paid off when Washington's troops defeated the Hessians and returned to Pennsylvania with all their supplies. Alexander had been sick when Washington was planning the attack, but he got out of bed and led an 8-mile march through the snow to join his commander. Alexander always wanted to be out on the fields fighting. He didn't like to sit on the sidelines. At this time, he commanded a regiment of 68 men. Alexander was a popular leader. He expected hard work from the men in his regiment, but he was known for the respect he showed every one of them. It was no surprise when a few weeks later, Washington asked Alexander to be his assistant. General Washington also gave him a promotion to lieutenant colonel. Alexander was only 22 years old. Another young man who made quite an impression on Washington was a 19-year-old Frenchman called the Marquis de Lafayette. Alexander and Lafayette quickly became good friends. Since Alexander could speak French, he could translate Lafayette's words for Washington. On June 28, 1778, all three men, Alexander, Lafayette, and General Washington, fought together at the Battle of Monmouth in Freehold, New Jersey. It was a fierce battle. As Alexander rode into the fight, his horse was shot out right from under him, and he had to be carried off the field. But as the sun set, the British retreated, and Alexander was reunited with his friends. In the winter of 1780, Alexander was in Morristown, New Jersey, with the Continental Army. That is where he met Eliza Schuyler. Eliza's father, Philip, was a general who lived in Albany, New York. He was very well known and wealthy. Philip Schuyler had 3 sons and 4 daughters at this time. Eliza had come to Morristown to visit her aunt, but she soon became very interested in Alexander. He knew right away he wanted her to be his wife. In November, Alexander went to Albany to marry Eliza. He invited his father and his brother to the wedding, but James and their father were still living in the West Indies on 2 different islands. Neither Alexander's father nor his brother could attend the wedding, but he was warmly welcomed into the Schuyler family. Philip was proud of his new son-in-law, and Eliza's siblings loved him too. For the first time since his mother's death, Alexander had a real family. Being the assistant to George Washington was an important job, but Alexander was frustrated because General Washington was so protective of him. He wanted Alexander away from the battlefield where he might get hurt. But Alexander dreamed of being a war hero. Finally, he became so impatient that he actually quit his job as Washington's assistant. He and Eliza moved into a house on the east bank of the Hudson River, just opposite from Washington's headquarters. Alexander continued to pester Washington to send him into battle. Finally, Alexander got his wish. General Washington gave him command of a small unit of men. Alexander was ready to fight. Eliza returned to Albany. She was expecting their first child, and Alexander could not stop thinking about the future. What would happen when the country finally won its independence? He had many ideas. At that time, the 13 American colonies worked independently of one another. The war was the first thing that had really united them all. The American government in 1781, the Continental Congress, was organized under what was called the Articles of Confederation. Alexander thought that if America was going to be an independent nation, it would need a strong central government. That way, the states could all work together. He thought the government should have a bank of its own that could lend and borrow money for the new country. He studied the banking systems of other countries like Great Britain to plan a system of money and banking for America. In October 1781, Alexander was sent to Yorktown, Virginia. There, he and Lafayette met up with General Washington. The British commander, George Cornwallis, had stationed his troops nearby. On the night of October 14th, Alexander led his men on a charge against the British troops. The Continental Army won. Cornwallis's surrender to General Washington signaled that the British had given up. Although the war went on for 2 more years, the battle at Yorktown is usually seen as the turning point, the beginning of the end for British rule in America. Alexander was a hero. He was also a father. Eliza had a son named Philip on January 22nd, 1782. Alexander couldn't wait to get home to be with him. The family all lived in the Schuyler mansion in Albany with Eliza's parents. Alexander then devoted himself to studying law and soon earned a license to be a lawyer in New York. Often he worked with Burr, who had also become a lawyer. Alexander surprised many people by sometimes working for Tories. These were people who had supported the British during the Revolutionary War. They hadn't wanted the American colonies to become independent. Many people felt the Tories had no right to expect an American lawyer to defend them. But Alexander thought everyone deserved equal rights in the courts, no matter what they believed. He also often defended poor people who couldn't afford to pay him. He knew what it was like to be poor and not be able to defend himself. He wanted better for other people. Just as Alexander had predicted, it was hard for the country to continue operating under the Articles of Confederation. For instance, the northern states had spent a lot of money during the war. The southern states had not spent as much because most of the fighting had been in the north. If there was a strong central government, Alexander thought, it could distribute the debt, the money that had been borrowed and was now owed, equally. Since the war was fought for everyone, this was only fair, but under the Articles of Confederation, the states could still decide for themselves, and the southern states did not want to pay for the north. In 1782, Alexander met a new friend who agreed with his ideas for a central government. His name was James Madison. Madison was representing his home state of Virginia. Hamilton was representing New York. Each man supported the other's ideas about the country needing a strong central government. Alexander, Eliza, and Philip moved to New York City in 1783. Alexander was very interested in the finances of his home state of New York. America was a young country with hardly any banks. The Bank of North America was established in Philadelphia in 1781. Alexander wanted to set up the same type of bank in New York, one that would lend notes, paper money, as well as gold and silver. Alexander's Bank of New York opened in 1784 and is still operating today. By 1787, Alexander's family had grown. He had 3 children, Philip, Angelica, and Alexander, and an adopted daughter, Fanny. The country had come to agree with him that they needed a different government to replace the Articles of Confederation. But would this new government be any better than the last? Alexander was determined to make sure that it would. Alexander and his friend James Madison wanted to explain exactly why America needed a strong bank and a central government. They wanted a ruling body for the country that could tax each state in order to raise money. They laid out their ideas for how the new government would work in a series of essays they called the Federalist Papers. The word federal meant an agreement between people. The word Federalist meant the colonies should unite and form a more powerful government together in addition to each state's own governing group. Alexander wanted the states to agree to one central government. The Federalist Papers called for a government with 3 branches, a president, executive, a Congress, legislative, and a Supreme Court, judicial. As members of the Continental Congress, Alexander and James Madison were not allowed to talk about this subject publicly. So no one at the time knew who was writing the Federalist Papers, but everyone was reading them in the newspapers. When the Constitution for the new government was finally written, many of its ideas came from Alexander's and James' 85 Federalist Papers. They describe much of what our federal government is today. The Constitution itself was written by many people working together, including James Madison, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton. In order for the Constitution to become the basis of a new government, it had to be agreed to by at least 9 out of the 13 states. People who supported the new Constitution became known as Federalists because they wanted a strong federal government. Those who didn't want it were called anti-Federalists. One by one, the states agreed to the new Constitution. When New York voted yes, they held a big celebration. Even though they didn't know Alexander had written many of the Federalist Papers, his defense of the Constitution was so well known that they honored him along with it. The new government became official in July 1788, just a few months after Alexander and Eliza welcomed their 4th child, James. This new government would need a president, and Alexander knew exactly who it should be, George Washington. In 1789, George Washington won by a landslide. John Adams became the vice president. Washington had to choose men to help him run the government. These advisors were known as his cabinet. One of the cabinet positions was for a secretary of the Treasury, who would be in charge of financial matters. Washington's first choice was Robert Morris, the former superintendent of finance. Morris turned down the job. but he suggested Alexander for the position. Washington was surprised. Even though he loved Alexander like a son, he had no idea Alexander knew anything about finances, banking, or economics. When he offered him the job, Alexander happily accepted. He quit his law practice so that he could focus entirely on his new role with the new government. Alexander also thought that if he was going to work for the government, he should not have any other job because that might prevent him from being fair to everyone. For instance, people he had defended as a lawyer might expect him to support laws that helped them more than others, and he didn't want any of his clients or old associates asking for favors. George Washington was sworn in as president on April 30th, 1789. The new government of the United States of America was now official. As 34 years old, Alexander Hamilton was its first Secretary of the Treasury. He was eager to serve his country. In 1789, the United States government was set up just the way it is today. The first Congress had always been held in session since March. Let me say that again. The first Congress had already been in session since March. It was made up of a Senate and a House of Representatives that made laws. The Senate had 2 representatives for each of the 13 states. The House of Representatives had different numbers of congressmen from each state based on how many people lived there. The first Supreme Court met on February 2nd, 1790. It was the court's job to decide whether a law followed the rules that had been established by the Constitution. Alexander was the Secretary of the Treasury. The Treasury is a place where money is kept, but it can also mean the money itself. He advised President Washington on all kinds of money matters and financial decisions. Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State. He advised the president on U.S. relations with foreign countries. People both in the United States and around the world quickly came to see that Alexander Hamilton was one of the most important people in the new country. Many remembered him as a war hero at Yorktown, but he was now famous as Washington's most trusted advisor and one of the creators of the government. Alexander had a lot of ideas about the U.S. Treasury. For example, he thought the federal government should pay off all the money that the individual states had borrowed as loans during the Revolutionary War. In order to do this, there would need to be a federal bank, a government-run bank that would collect taxes. Some states, especially in the South, had already paid off their debts. By 1789, they didn't think it was fair that other people shouldn't have to do the same. Other states, especially in the North, thought Alexander's idea was good because most of the fighting had been done there. Therefore, their governments had spent more money to fund the army. Why shouldn't the whole country help pay it off when it was everyone's war? Alexander hoped to use taxes to pay off these debts. He especially wanted to tax imports arriving from other countries. This, too, worried some people in the South. Although their economy was based on selling and exporting cotton to other countries, they were afraid that these new taxes would cause other countries to tax American cotton in return. They thought Alexander was giving the North an unfair advantage. Alexander thought that if America had a bank that was strong enough to loan and borrow money, it would show that the United States could do the same for other countries as well. He felt that having a federal bank was the only way to compete with other countries like England. In February 1790, Alexander made a speech to Congress explaining his financial plans. A few days later, he was surprised and hurt when his friend James Madison made a speech that criticized it. Alexander felt betrayed. People in the government and all around the country were starting to fall into 2 groups when it came to how they thought America should be run. The Federalists believed in Alexander's ideas. They also thought that the United States should have a strong relationship with England because England's government was much like the one they'd built. The anti-Federalists became known as the Democrat-Republicans. These included Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who had by then changed his mind about Alexander's ideas. They believed in strong state governments and an economy based on farming, and they wanted a close relationship with France. The Democrat-Republicans did not like how close Alexander was to George Washington. The president seemed to listen to his advice on everything. For a few months in 1790, Washington got very sick, and Alexander even seemed to take over for him, just as he had taken over the trading floor as a boy in the Caribbean. The newspapers were filled with articles and letters written by people on both the Federalist and the anti-Federalist sides. Sometimes they personally attacked the men in the government, and one article accused Alexander of using his role in the government to make money for himself. Imagine someone in the government doing that. Huh. This was especially hard for Alexander to hear because he thought it was so important for him to be honest with America's money. He'd even quit his law practice to be fair, which made it harder for him to support his growing family. In 1792, Eliza and Alexander had a fifth child, John Church Hamilton. That same year, Washington was elected for a second term as president. By this time, Alexander had moved his family from Wall Street to Market Street in Philadelphia. Their new home was near the presidential mansion where George Washington lived. From 1789 to 1790, New York City was the capital of the United States. Although Washington, D.C. had been declared the capital in 1790, the city was not yet built. The new capital city would not be ready until 1800. Until that time, the federal government would be based in Philadelphia. In 1793, there was an outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia. Over 4,000 people died. Alexander and Eliza both got sick. They went to stay at a summer house they owned outside the city. The children were sent to the Schuyler home further north in Albany so they wouldn't get sick. Alexander's childhood friend, Edward Stevens, remember Ned, was now a doctor. He rushed to their home to treat the Hamiltons. Because he had grown up in St. Croix where yellow fever was common, Edward had different ideas about how to treat the disease. While some doctors were draining their patients' blood, Edward's methods encouraged them to rest and get stronger. Alexander and Eliza both recovered. Alexander was so grateful to his friend, Edward, he wrote a letter to the newspaper about how everyone should use Dr. Stevens' treatments. But even this was turned into a political fight. Democrat-Republicans claimed Alexander hadn't even been sick. They said he was faking all along, and that the letter was written to promote Dr. Stevens' business. All this political fighting was very tiring. It was not surprising when both Alexander and Thomas Jefferson decided to leave their government jobs. Alexander left his position as Secretary of Treasury in January 1795. Although he was only 40, he planned to retire from the government to be with his family and work as a lawyer. But Alexander could never stay on the sidelines for long. Now that he had left his government job, Alexander decided to move his family to a new house called the Grange. The house was in Harlem, farther north in Manhattan. In 1795, the neighborhood of Harlem was practically considered the country. Alexander named the house the Grange after his father's family castle in Scotland. Alexander had not seen his father since he was 11 years old, but Alexander had sent money to him. After leaving office, Alexander took a 3-week trip around Cayuga Lake in New York State to meet the native people there. Alexander had often tried to use his influence in the government to protect the rights of American Indians. He helped manage a school that taught both English and American Indian languages. When he returned to the city, he immediately began his law practice once again. That same year, Alexander received an unexpected letter. It was from the Hamiltons of Scotland, his father's family. They, like the rest of the world, had been watching the formation of this new country and knew that their famous relative had played a role in it. After years of ignoring Alexander because his father was not married to his mother, Alexander's noble Scottish relatives wanted to meet him. Of course, he was happy to invite them to visit him in New York. In the spring of 1796, after 7 years of being president, George Washington decided to retire. He asked Alexander to write his farewell address. The speech was published on September 19, 1796, and was immediately reprinted in all the newspapers. It was the most famous letter written to the nation Washington ever published, but for years, no one knew it was written by Alexander Hamilton. John Adams was sworn in as the second president of the United States on March 4th, 1797. But Alexander was no longer a part of the president's cabinet. He was happy just to be spending time with his family. Eliza's sister, Angelica, who had been living in England with her husband for years, returned to America, and Alexander and Eliza were very happy to see her again. In August 1797, Alexander and Eliza had another son, William Stephen. The Hamiltons had 6 children. the oldest now 15. They were close to both Eliza's family and to Alexander's relatives. They enjoyed welcoming family and anyone else who needed a place to stay into their home. For a man who once had no one, Alexander was now surrounded by people who loved him. In September 1798, New York City was hit with a yellow fever epidemic. Alexander's family was spared this time, but people all over New York were still frightened. Nearly 45 people were dying each day in the city. People did not yet understand that yellow fever was spread by mosquitoes, but they did not know that standing water and unsanitary conditions made the epidemic worse. Many people drank dirty or polluted water because they had no access to clean water. In 1799, Aaron Burr proposed to do something about this. At that time, Aaron Burr was employed by the federal government of New York State. He wanted to start the Manhattan Company. This new business would lay pipes to bring clean water to the people living in the lower end, the southern tip of New York City. Alexander thought this was a great idea and supported Aaron's plan. But the truth was that Aaron Burr had other plans besides bringing clean water to everyone. The real purpose of the Manhattan Company was to raise money by telling people it was for clean water, but then use only part of that money for the job. The rest would be available to organizers of the plan, men like Aaron Burr. A single clause of the company's charter, the document that set the rules for what the company could do, allowed the Manhattan Company to use any money it wasn't using for water for other kinds of banking business. In New York at that time, there were only two banks. One was the state bank that belonged to the government. The other was the Bank of New York, which Alexander Hamilton had helped to start. Aaron Burr wanted to become an important man in New York. He chose to create his own bank that would lend him money whenever he asked for it. It could also make him a lot of money. The Manhattan Company raised $2 million for its water system, but only used $100,000 to actually provide water. People continued to get sick. Alexander was furious. From that moment on, he knew that Aaron Burr was a dishonest man, so he was not happy when Thomas Jefferson was elected president in 1801 with none other than Aaron Burr as vice president. Alexander and Eliza now had 7 children. Their daughter, Elizabeth Hawley, also known as Eliza, had been born in 1799. By 1801, their oldest son, Philip, was a handsome, charming young man of 19 who was very loyal to his father. When a man named George Eaker gave a speech that insulted Alexander, Philip confronted him about it. Eaker called Philip a rascal. This was a very serious word in 1801. Philip demanded an apology. Eaker refused. It could be Ecker, E-A-C-K-E-R, Eaker. Philip wasted no time and quickly challenged Eaker to a duel. When Philip talked to his father about the duel, Alexander suggested that he should throw away his first shot. He meant that Philip should not shoot directly at him. When Eaker realized this, he would also fire his pistol in the air instead of at Philip. What kind of man, Alexander thought, would shoot someone who wasn't shooting at them? Philip followed his father's advice. Unfortunately, Eaker did not. Philip was shot and carried to the house of one of his aunts. Alexander and Eliza rushed to his side. Eliza was pregnant with her 8th child. Philip died the day after the duel. 6 months later, in June 1802, Eliza gave birth to their final child, a son they named Philip, after the older brother he would never know. Alexander loved his new son, whom he called Little Phil, but he knew their family would never be the same. From then on, Alexander was a sadder, more troubled man. The entire Hamilton family was heartbroken after Philip's death. For months, Alexander couldn't think about anything else, but slowly he went back to work as a lawyer. Aaron Burr was still vice president. He did not think he would be reelected, so instead he ran for governor of New York in 1804. Of course, Alexander still considered Burr to be a dishonest man. He supported Burr's opponent in the election, Morgan Lewis. When Aaron Burr lost the race for governor, he put some of the blame on Alexander. In 1804, Alexander went to dinner at the house of a friend, John Taylor, over dinner. The men talked about many things, including Aaron Burr. Afterward, another of the dinner guests, Dr. Charles Cooper, wrote a letter to his brother telling him all about his dinner with the great Alexander Hamilton. In the letter, he mentioned that Alexander had called Aaron Burr untrustworthy. Somehow this letter got into the hands of a newspaper publisher who immediately printed it in his paper for the whole city to read. Many people say they didn't believe Alexander would say such a thing, but Dr. Cooper said it was all true. In fact, he said that he knew an even more despicable thing that Alexander had said. He was hinting that Alexander had said even worse things about Aaron Burr that night. Aaron Burr demanded an apology. Alexander refused. Their two friends, Nathan Pendleton and William P. Van Ness, tried to work out a peace between the two men, but they could not. Alexander and Burr decided to fight a duel. Alexander did not tell his family about the duel. He quietly finished up all the law cases he was working on so that his business would be settled and his clients would not need him for anything. He told a few close friends that he planned to not shoot at Aaron Burr. Since his son Philip's death, he just couldn't bring himself to shoot at another man. He wrote goodbye letters to his family in case he did not survive the duel. On July 11, 1804, Alexander and his second, Nathan Pendleton, rowed across the river to Weehawken, New Jersey. That was the same spot where Philip had been killed 3 years earlier. The duel was set for 7 o'clock in the morning. The only other person there beside the two men and their seconds was Dr. David Hossack. Alexander chose to stand on the north side of the clearing facing the sun. Each man had a flintlock pistol, the same type Philip used in his duel, that had been borrowed from Alexander's brother-in-law, John Church. The two men raised their guns and fired. Alexander's shot, as he planned, landed nowhere near Aaron Burr. It hit a tree. Burr shot Alexander above the hip. He fell to the ground. Nathaniel Pendleton and Dr. Hossack carried Alexander to the boat and rushed him back across the river to the city. William P. Van Ness hurried Aaron Burr from the scene so that he wouldn't be arrested. Alexander was taken to the house of a friend, William Bayard. Soon his whole family was gathered around him. By the next afternoon, he had died from his injury. All the businesses in New York City closed for his funeral. New Yorkers wore black armbands in his memory. The New York Supreme Court draped its bench in black fabric for the rest of its term. Alexander Hamilton's funeral was the grandest the city had ever seen. Many in the crowd were angry. They thought Aaron Burr should have been punished. Eliza did not attend her husband's funeral. She was too sad to leave the house. Alexander had left her a letter saying that he loved her and their family, ending with adieu, best of wives and best of women. Embrace all my darling children for me. Eliza would devote the rest of her life to protecting her husband's memory. Aaron Burr never went to jail and never said he was sorry. He often referred to Alexander as my friend Hamilton, whom I shot. People were shocked at how little he seemed to care about what he had done. Some were so angry they threatened to burn down Burr's house. His reputation never recovered. One newspaper editor in Charleston, South Carolina, said that Burr's heart was stuffed with cinders racked from the fires of hell. Burr became worried that he would be arrested for murder, so he fled New York and moved to Philadelphia. The enormous influence of Alexander Hamilton is still felt today. We continue to rely on the national banking system that he established, and the Bank of New York, which he founded, is the oldest bank in the United States. Because of his role as the first Secretary of the Treasury, his portrait is on the $10 bill. The Federalist Papers, Alexander's brilliant framework for how the U.S. government should be run, is still quoted by our Supreme Court justices. In 2015, a new musical called Hamilton debuted in New York City. The show was based on a biography of Alexander Hamilton that was written by Ron Chernow. Alexander Hamilton was not born in the United States, but he made the country his home. In some ways, he shaped our system of government and our country more than any of the other founding fathers. He arrived in the American colonies with nothing and became one of the most important men in American history. We will always be in his debt. The end.